Become a member right now. Thank you.
Next time on Finding Your Roots,
Wow,
Larry David,
I'm a little more exotic than I thought I was.
Bernie Sanders,
What a different world. What?
and the DNA discovery.
Oh my God, are you kidding? That is unbelievable. Now that's something.
Finding Your Roots.
Tonight at 8 on WTTW. Programming on WTTW originates from the Alexandra C. and John D. Nichols Broadcast Operations Center. We gratefully acknowledge their outstanding support.
On Nova, a disaster unfolds in gripping detail.
Flying along the coast is horrifying.
Now, eyewitness accounts and new evidence on the ground help scientists piece together the most complete picture yet of what triggered the catastrophe.
The energy that drove this earthquake had been building up for a couple of 100 years.
10 billion tons of water.
Reaching at times the speed of a jet aircraft.
An in-depth investigation of Japan's killer quake.
Wednesday at 9 on WTTW.
Hi, Chicago. I'm Glenn. You're watching WTTW.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Polk Brothers Foundation, working to make Chicago a place where all people have the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
we'll be able to start getting payments out this month.
Illinois Congress members break down what's in the nearly $2 trillion stimulus bill expected to be signed by President Biden this week.
The largest mass vaccination site by a mile.
Confusion over who can get a vaccine and when at the just opened United Center vaccination site. We have a live report.
Fully vaccinated people can visit with other fully vaccinated people.
The CDC announces new COVID guidelines for those who've been vaccinated. An infectious disease doctor joins us to explain.
Like I kept digging a hole in the hole and I couldn't find a way out of it.
Legislation awaiting the governor's approval could effectively end the payday loan industry in Illinois, but could it have unintended consequences?
Some research shows an increase in anti-Asian hate crimes nationwide in 2020. We hear about local efforts aimed at combating intolerance.
And the Illinois tollway goes I-Pass only, but does a cashless society leave some people out? But first, some of today's top stories. 3 jurors have been seated today in the murder trial for the police officer accused of killing George Floyd. The process is expected to take weeks as attorneys work to find impartial jurors. The first juror today to be dismissed today wrote on her questionnaire that she wanted to be on the jury to, quote, give her opinion of the unjust death of George Floyd. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, seen here on the right of your screen, is facing second-degree and manslaughter charges for the death of Floyd last summer after video circulated around the world of Chauvin pressing his knee into Floyd's neck until he died. Opening statements in this trial aren't expected to begin until the end of the month. Illinois public health officials say another 1,500 people have been diagnosed with the coronavirus since yesterday, and another 16 have died. This means the state has passed more than 1.2 million total cases since the pandemic began nearly a year ago, and 20,781 people have died. Meanwhile, the Chicago Department of Public Health has shuffled states on its emergency travel order list. Texas and Nebraska have moved back into the orange tier, meaning travelers from those states would need to quarantine for 10 days or have a negative COVID test 72 hours before arriving in the city. There are a total of 24 states in the orange zone, but 9 other states have moved into the yellow zone, meaning their coronavirus case levels are low enough that no quarantine or negative test is required when traveling to Chicago from those states. There are a total of 26 states in the yellow zone plus Puerto Rico. Nearly 1 in 5 Illinois residents has received at least the first dose of the coronavirus vaccine. Thousands more will reach that point over the coming weeks at their doctor's office, a pharmacy, and as of today, at the United Center. The federally run mass vaccination site officially opened this morning to delight and confusion. Amanda Venicky joins us now outside the United Center. Amanda, how is it going there?
Brandis, some 6,000 people are set to get the Pfizer vaccine here at the United Center every day for the next 6 weeks. But if you are trying to get one of those appointments, or perhaps you were able to snag one and then you're confused about whether you're going to keep it or not, well, there is good reason to be confused. Even dignitaries got their numbers a bit muddled today, with one official at first saying that 110,000 appointments had already been booked, and then later a clarification from the city's public health commissioner saying no, as of this point, it's about 50,000 reservations made. And later in the day, Dr. Allison Arwade really did seem to give a nod to that confusion.
And I know there's been a lot of questions about the United Center, and I know that the renewed focus on equity that has come has led to some changes and even some confusion for people. And I apologize for people who are feeling unsure about this resource.
But before I go on, a quick note that the media is set apart some from where individuals that are getting that vaccine until 8 o'clock tonight are. Media guidelines did ask that we not bother them for the sake of their privacy. So the video that you should be seeing on your screen is actually from a preview yesterday afternoon. Now, as for that confusion, that stems from a day prior, Sunday, when access to appointments suddenly got switched. At first, anyone age 65 or older from anywhere in Illinois could sign up. There was also a huge rush during a brief window with 754 appointments per minute booked during a window that let in younger individuals with certain comorbidities, things like cancer or pulmonary disease. Officials say that the early data from that showed that less than 40% of those who got appointments were Chicago residents. Already called that unacceptable, defeating the entire purpose of FEMA deciding to put a mass vaccination clinic here on Chicago's West Side.
We have a lot of neighborhoods that have been burdened heavily by COVID. A lot of heavily Black and heavily Latinx neighborhoods, a lot of neighborhoods that have more barriers to getting vaccinated. And one of the decisions for placing the vaccination center here was recognizing that we really wanted to reach Chicago residents.
And so for now, there is really no way to make an appointment here. Temporarily, access cut off. It is set to reopen later this week. In the meanwhile, local and state officials say that they're going to try to work to fill those appointments behind the scenes with an aim of 60% of reservations going to Chicago residents, 30% to residents of suburban Cook, and then 10% for those who live throughout the rest of Illinois. The city in particular targeting folks from vulnerable communities, including those near the United Center, Humboldt Park, for example, but also a handful of other zip codes that includes McKinley Park, Chatham, Roseland, South Shore. And then in cases, you're even going to have chunks of appointments booked and set aside for community groups to help get the word out. We didn't really get a ton of specifics from officials on that. Now, Arwade says that this focus on equity isn't just the right thing to do. She says it's the way to nip COVID in the bud.
Also the thing that gets our city past COVID, making sure more people are vaccinated in the heaviest hit zip codes is how we actually decrease our case rate, how we decrease the risk of variants, and how we're able to reopen the city and have lower risks.
To that end, she says the city is making progress in decreasing cases.
Particularly in Latinx Chicagoans, where we now are seeing case rates for COVID of Latinx Chicagoans that are not higher than you would expect them to be based on population, where our case rates are really looking like the city as far as race and ethnicity goes.
And when it comes to vaccinations, she says city data shows 59% going to Black and Latinx residents, which is about on par again with the city's population makeup. Now, statewide, about half of Illinoisans over the age of 65 have thus far received a COVID vaccine. Seniors do continue to be the target for vaccinations, though generally we are expecting eligibility to open up some by the end of March. Now, as for the United Center, despite that Madhouse on Madison moniker, things did appear to be pretty well organized here. You've got barricades, folks doing traffic control, and unlike if you were to come here for a Blackhawks or a Bulls game, vaccines free, but yes, also parking. Right now, by the way, this is all walk up to get one of those shots, but the city does expect in a couple of weeks to begin drive through. And while there is still not enough vaccine for everyone, officials are stressing that all of the vaccines being given here at the United Center, already expect some 180,000 of them. These are all vaccines that weren't in the initial allotment for the city and the state. So that does mean that another 180,000 people are going to get the COVID vaccine over these next 8 weeks or so. So with that, Brandis, back to you.
Okay, Amanda, thank you. And now to Paris with some local members of Congress. Paris.
Brandis, Congress is on the precipice of approving a nearly $2 trillion stimulus plan, and here's what President Biden had to say about it.
This plan puts us on a path to beating the virus. This plan gives those families who are struggling the most the help and the breathing room they need to get through this moment. This plan gives small businesses in this country a fighting chance to survive.
And here to talk about what's in the bill, what's changed, and what's next are Congressman Danny Davis, a Democrat from the Austin neighborhood, Congressman Sean Casten, a Democrat from Downers Grove, Congressman Rodney Davis, a Republican from Taylorville, and freshman Congresswoman Marie Newman, a Democrat from Chicago's southwest side. Welcome back to all of you. Let's get right down to the numbers on that stimulus, especially with that popular $1,400 direct payment. So that is for individuals making less than $75,000, couples making less than $150,000, an additional $1,400 for each dependent claimed on taxes, and then the $1,400 stimulus disappears for individuals making more than $80,000 and couples making more than $160,000. Congressman Davis passed the House. It just passed the Senate, and as part of this reconciliation process, has to go back to the House. Do you anticipate approval this week, and might it be bipartisan? Congressman Danny Davis, that is.
Oh, I think we're voting, and it's a done deal. The reality is, it's difficult for me to imagine how anyone could use their finger to vote against this bill. It does all the things that President Biden said it would do, but it does even more than that. It touches the lives of those individuals at the low end of the socioeconomic ladder, not only the $1,400, but the tax credits for children. I mean, this is like manna from heaven. I don't know how you could do much better than what this bill does, no matter where you are in the state of Illinois or anywhere in America.
There are a lot of elements in this bill. Congressman Rodney Davis, it was basically a party line vote in the House the first time. Do you, how will you vote, and do you anticipate any bipartisanship?
Well, my good friend Danny and I are going to have to disagree on this one. If it was manna from heaven, then the Democrats who are in charge would not have had to use the reconciliation process to pass it. We passed 5 bipartisan bills during the Trump administration to address COVID and COVID relief. As a matter of fact, hundreds of billions of dollars still are left unspent from the last bipartisan agreement we had in December. I'm going to easily vote no on this bill because only 9% of the almost $2 trillion on the backs of every taxpayer everywhere in America is only 9% is going to actually address getting more vaccines into the arms of every American and also true COVID-related causes.
There are a lot of different expenses in this bill. Congressman Casten, there's $350 billion for state and local governments. We talked about last time that Illinois is going to get a little over $7 billion for its state coffers. How can that money be spent?
Well, look, I want to just comment on the bipartisan point. The single biggest line item in this bill is the $1,400 checks to Americans, which was a big part of Donald Trump's campaign promise. I think that's pretty bipartisan to take an idea of the prior president. The state and local aid you talk about, and by the way, it's $13.7 billion to Illinois, although it's split between
to all
state,
different governments, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what you talked about at the state level, but then in addition, you know, in the counties I represent, $998 million to Cook, $179 million to DuPage, $135 million to Lake. I'm sorry to hear that Congressman Davis is going to vote against this, but there's $40 million to Champaign County downstate. This is real need that's solving an issue. Keep in mind, there's 9.5 million people who are out of work since the start of the pandemic, who permanently left the workforce. There's 1.4 million public sector workers who are unemployed. And yes, it was extremely bipartisan for us to support businesses through the PPP program and the prior packages. We never really had bipartisan support to support our states and municipalities, which means we didn't have bipartisan support for our teachers, for our firefighters, for funding our police. And that's unfortunate, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Congresswoman Newman, another part of this. Go ahead, Congressman Rodney Davis, go ahead.
That's just not true. As a matter of fact, there's over almost $60 billion left from the bipartisan piece of legislation that we put forth in December that could go to reopen our schools. And instead of planning to reopen our schools, the Biden administration is not putting forth a true effort that science and the experts say should be best and would be best for our kids moving into the future.
Speaking of,
you can have disagreements on legislation, but to say that the bills in the past didn't address those who needed help the most at every socioeconomic ladder, those who needed help the most when it came to our firefighters, our public employees, we did that together.
I have to get to that, Congresswoman.
Not one together.
I have to get Congresswoman Newman in here. Congresswoman Newman, speaking of children, explain the expanded child care tax credit and how many Illinoisans that it impacts and what that means in terms of money in their pocket.
Well, thank you. I want to respond to my colleague from Taylorsville, his comment around unspent money. So I actually asked the CEOs of Metra and the RTA, CTA, why they had not spent all the money. And they said, we were fearful that the Republicans would yank the money or not provide it. And it was a prudent, they need predictability in their revenue, right? So they actually did not spend down to zero as any smart business person or organizational executive would do. They saved some. And so their plan is to, now that they know that they are getting this other money, transportation and infrastructure money from this bill and then ultimately a stimulus bill, now they will spend down. In terms of the child credit, this is really significant. This is going to lift millions, upwards of 40 million children out of child poverty. So $3,000 a child is really, really important in providing all that a family needs. So the package overall is helping families, single moms, single dads, everybody. So the fact that some of the money wasn't spent down is simply because people were being prudent to make sure that they had enough to stretch through the pandemic. And I would just say further too that this was a bipartisan effort. I understand we're voting on party lines, but President Biden made every effort. Several people came, and they came with a very disrespectful amount. It was less than 1/3 of the offer that was on the table. That's disrespectful. That's not even negotiation. That's silliness. But also, too, the Republicans asked for targeted checks, and we did. So we accommodated some of their wishes. We listened to them several times. We gave them lots of time, and it ended up that we put some of their thoughts into the bill. So it was bipartisan on that side.
Congressman Danny Davis, another part of this bill is lower premiums in the form of tax credits for the Affordable Care Act. What will that mean for Illinoisans?
Well, it would mean a great deal, but I also want to, I just love these talking points that some of my Republican friends and colleagues make use of. Only
it's 3 against 1 here, so I'm going to have to give Congressman Rodney Davis a chance to follow up, but go ahead, Congressman.
Yeah, but 9%. People couldn't get a vaccine if they couldn't get to the places where it was being used and given. And so every bit of this money, quite frankly, ends up being an aid to rebuilding confidence in our economy and giving people the wherewithal. If your restaurant is closed and you can't go to work, and you get some help to open it, now you can get to the station where they're given the vaccine. Otherwise, you can't even get there. So to suggest that somehow only 9% of this money is going to deal with the coronavirus, the pandemic, I think that's way far-fetched.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, Congressman Rodney Davis. I'll give you a chance to follow up in our next segment a bit later in the show. We'll be joined again by Congress members later in the program to discuss voting rights, infrastructure, and more. But for now, our thanks to Representative Danny Davis, Sean Casten, Rodney Davis, and Marie Newman. And now to Phil Ponce for a look at new COVID-19 guidelines from the CDC. Phil.
Paris, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are announcing new guidelines for people who have been fully vaccinated. Part of the guidelines allow vaccinated people to visit each other indoors without masks or social distancing. Are these new rules a glimpse of a return to normal life? Joining us now is Dr. Emily Landon, Executive Medical Director for Infection Prevention and Control at UChicago Medicine. Doctor, thank you for joining us. And first of all, let's take a look at the three main bullet points from the new CDC guidelines. They are for fully vaccinated people, say that indoor visits without masks or 6 feet social distancing are allowed. Indoor visits with unvaccinated people from one other household are also allowed. And folks who come into contact with someone who's tested positive for COVID-19 are not required to quarantine or get tested. First of all, more on what these guidelines are designed to do. How would you describe them in summary?
Well, I think that they are designed to allow people to get back to normal a little bit. As we learn more about how effective these vaccines are and how to control COVID, everyone has been wanting to get people back to normal. And this is a really great, important, sort of guidance that lets everyone know what they can and can't do once they get vaccinated. I know there's going to be even more coming behind this as we get a little further down the road and more people vaccinated. But in general, they're designed to let us get back to normal.
All right, vaccinated people interacting with other vaccinated people. What's the bottom line?
Yeah, so we know that once people have been vaccinated, they are unlikely to have anything serious happen if they get COVID. But they could maybe once in a while pass on COVID, a mild case of COVID, to someone else. And so this guidance is really about trying to make sure that they don't have contact with people who are very high risk for COVID. They're saying if you're around other vaccinated people, that's fine. They're just going to get a cold too. So no big deal. If you happen to have an asymptomatic case and pass it on, they're probably not going to get sick anyway.
So
then go ahead.
So I was going to say, so if you're vaccinated, interacting with other vaccinated people, you do not need to social distance and you do not need to wear a mask. But say you're somebody my age and I want to visit my adult children who are not vaccinated. What then?
Well, then the recommendation is that it's okay for a vaccinated person to visit one unvaccinated household at a time. And that's really about not letting two unvaccinated households get together without wearing masks. It's not about the vaccinated person at all. So you want the vaccinated person to come into that unvaccinated household and be a visitor who is not likely to bring anything bad into the mix and not likely to pick up anything that's going to be dangerous from that family. Now, there's one caveat. If you are often around other people that are high risk for bad outcomes of COVID and are unvaccinated, or if one of the family members that you're visiting is high risk for COVID, then you got to keep the masks, because you still could, that sort of breakthrough infection that you don't even know you have is still a problem, a possibility that we have to account for, because there's still too many cases.
How about if you are a vaccinated, say, grandparent like I am, how about visiting healthy grandchildren who are 7, 8, 9, 10 years old?
It's time. Go visit your grandkids. This is what it's about. Once you've been vaccinated, you're unlikely to pick up anything dangerous from the grandkids. Even if they're carrying COVID and they don't know it, you could pick it up from them, but you're probably only going to have a mild cold at the worst. And so, not a big deal.
But how about if you are vaccinated and you want to be around your grandchildren? There's still this gray area about what the extent to which you might still be asymptomatic, but conceivably pass it on to, like, your grandchild.
Yeah, it is possible, but that's unlikely. Remember, as we're going forward, and part of the reason these guidelines are coming out is because we're learning that people who get COVID after they've had both doses of their vaccine, or one, a little less known about the Johnson & Johnson, but still very good. The likelihood is great that you will have symptoms, and then you shouldn't visit your grandkids if you have symptoms. You should still get tested. But the people who are asymptomatic have such low amounts of virus circulating that they don't appear to be spreading it to other people. So even though we're catching some people with these unusual positive tests after the vaccine, they're not even giving it to their own families. And so the likelihood that you're going to pass COVID on to your grandchildren is low. Still too high, still not nothing. And so if they're high risk for a bad outcome from COVID, then you want to keep the masks for a little while longer. But I think everything's going in the right direction.
But the rules are still different when one is out in public, even if you have been vaccinated. Briefly, what are they?
Yeah, so we still want people in medium to large gatherings and out in public to just wear their masks. It's hard to know who's vaccinated and who's just not following the rules, and how are you going to keep track of all that? Plus, we don't know what's really passing around. We want to minimize the likelihood of passing around any kind of these variants or things that may break through our COVID vaccines. But we also want to allow people to see their families and get back to some sense of normalcy, because we know the vaccines are really working well. So that is sort of a way to balance that idea that there are things that we can't account for, we don't know all the way yet, but at the same time, we feel really confident that you can do these things.
And last question that has to do with travel. So many people have been wanting to travel. If you're vaccinated, you're traveling with somebody who's vaccinated, okay to travel, yes or no?
So CDC is still saying no. And I totally understand that. We're looking at, the likelihood of a breakthrough infection in a vaccinated person is very low. However, the variants are more likely to cause that kind of a breakthrough infection, and there's still just too many cases. And so CDC is still saying that unless it's essential travel, you should avoid it for now. I think that they will probably change that guidance after spring break, but because so many people usually travel for spring break, it doesn't make sense to open up a blanket thing saying, just go ahead and travel right now. Really, the best thing to do is for us all to stay put through one more of these little cycles, that spring break cycle. And then I suspect we'll be seeing a lot better, sort of more advice about pro-traveling advice coming in the early summer.
Dr. Landon, thank you so much as always. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
And up next, the payday lending industry in Illinois and what shutting it down could mean. So stay with us.
Imagine taking out a short-term loan, making payments on it, and then discovering that you owe 4 or 5 times the original amount. It's a reality many lower-income Illinoisans face who are caught up in a cycle of predatory lending. Now, legislation awaiting the governor's signature could shut down the payday lending industry in Illinois for good, but payday proponents say that could lead to a host of bigger problems.
It is a very big, scary number, but when you're desperate, you don't see it.
Keisha Warren needed a short-term cash infusion of $1,250 to make payroll costs for her small janitorial services company. So in 2019, she took out an auto title loan. That's a short-term loan that uses the borrower's vehicle as collateral. She says she was shut off from more traditional bank loans.
It's the fact that no one wants to lend to a person that has over $100,000 in student loans. So it was very difficult for me to get a regular loan.
The loan came with a yearly interest rate of 197%. That ballooned her initial $1,250 to a total payment of $3,400 that she paid off early last week. It's a story that plays out constantly in Black and Latino communities. Southside State Senator Jacqueline Collins co-sponsored the Illinois Predatory Lending Prevention Act, which would cap annual interest rates on short-term loans at 36%.
Anything above 36% is predatory and usury. And so we know that high-cost payday loans and auto loans have stripped communities of billions and billions of dollars, primarily the Black and brown communities in the state of Illinois.
The bill would impact payday loans, normally a 2-week loan where the money is taken from the borrower's next paycheck. It would also impact auto title loans and other short-term lending products.
Do people get in trouble with loans? Sure. I mean, anybody does.
Steve Brubaker, who lobbies state government on behalf of the Illinois Small Loan Association, says the 36% ceiling rate in the bill will effectively put most payday and auto title loan stores out of business while cutting off a lifeline for borrowers with poor credit.
We're closing these stores, we're firing the people, we're not providing the customers with any options, and we're taking $1 billion out of the marketplace, which was used to fix your car, buy a new refrigerator, spend it on kids' clothes for school.
The average APR for an auto title loan in Illinois is 197%. The average payday loan rate is 297%. But Brubaker says the numbers are misleading. When measuring the typical 2-week length of the loan, it comes out to about $15 on the 100.
When they see that giant number, they misunderstand really what the customer has to pay back. The average loan amount for a payday loan in 2019 was $340. And the average fee amount that was charged was $52.
What's misleading is that it's a short-term loan, because what happens is folks have to borrow over and over to pay back the previous loan.
Brent Adams is vice president at the Woodstock Institute, a nonprofit that advocates on behalf of low-income communities and communities of color. He says the payday lending industry relies on hooking borrowers into a never-ending cycle of debt with hidden rollover fees.
So what the lender will do is when the bill comes due, they will offer them an option that allows them to roll over the loan, refinance the loan, take out a different loan.
The next Friday came around, I owed exactly what I borrowed, and it was crazy, and I made a double payment, and it was very upsetting, but it's just like I kept digging a hole in a hole, and I couldn't find a way out of it.
Governor Pritzker is expected to sign the legislation, but the issue might not end there. Opponents of the payday lending industry say they're worried about a series of bills circulating in the Illinois General Assembly right now that they say would gut some of the protections that are in the bill awaiting the governor's signature. Sponsors of 2 such bills in the House and Senate declined to be interviewed for this story. Brubaker says he believes the 36% rate cap will have the unintended consequence of pushing borrowers to even more dangerous and unregulated loan products online. But Senator Collins says credit unions and community banks can pick up the slack. And Governor Pritzker has until early next month to decide what to do with the bill. In a statement, his office says, quote, the governor is still reviewing the bill, but shares the sponsors' concerns that predatory lending disproportionately impacts communities of color who don't have equitable access to traditional banking. And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, members of Congress look ahead to the next big debates, including infrastructure and voting rights. A new report points to an increase in anti-Asian hate crimes reported last year in several major cities across the country. And why businesses want to get away from handling cash and how the costs of cashless transactions get passed on to consumers. But first, some more of today's top stories. Despite a federal review greenlighting the Obama Presidential Center last month, legal challenges surrounding it are not over. Protect Our Parks has filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court to revisit an appellate court decision issued last August. That decision said the nonprofit lacked any grounds to sue in the first place. The filing comes days after the Obama Foundation revealed new design details for the center's proposed 235-foot tower, an excerpt from a speech delivered by former President Barack Obama that'll be carved into the building's crown. More on this story on our website. And in the ongoing debate over metal scrapper General Iron's move to the South Side, health professionals are now calling on the city to deny the company's permit to protect residents in the neighborhood.
Allowing the relocation and operation of General Iron's facility will place another source of environmental pollutants in a mostly Latino and Black community already burdened by serious health threats, continuing an unjust pattern of environmental racism.
The group of health professionals and activists has circulated a letter saying General Iron was repeatedly cited for violating environmental laws at its Lincoln Park location, and that moving it to the southeast side would deepen environmental racism and existing inequities. Meanwhile, a federal judge is expected to rule next month in a lawsuit aiming to prevent the company from receiving a key city permit. And now back to Paris with some more from members of Congress. Paris.
Thanks, Brandis. Earlier in the show, we asked 4 members of Congress about what to expect from the stimulus bill that will be voted on tomorrow. And now we're going to look ahead at other priorities and issues. Joining us again are Representatives Danny Davis, Sean Casten, Rodney Davis, and Marie Newman. Congressman Rodney Davis, I just wanted to give you a chance to respond. Congressman Danny Davis was critical of your opposition to the COVID stimulus. Just give you a little bit of time to respond to that before we move on to another issue.
You know, we're going to have disagreements here, and Danny and I are good friends. Marie and I just got to know each other, look forward to a working relationship with her, but we disagree on this issue. The cost of this bill, in my opinion, greatly outweighs the long-term benefits. And frankly, transit districts in my part of downstate Illinois have had no problem spending their COVID dollars. There's not some conspiracy that Republicans, big bad Republicans, are going to take those dollars away. And I certainly look forward to representatives of RTA and Metra and others coming in front of our Highways and Transit Subcommittee and asking them questions about this fear.
And that brings me to my next topic. Congressman Casten, President Biden has talked about infrastructure. A number as high as $4 trillion has been thrown around for a potential infrastructure bill. What would be the big needs in Illinois if such a bill were to come to the floor?
So, obviously, what is the Society of Civil Engineers told me this week that they have recently raised the grade of American infrastructure. We're now a C-. We can do better. That's a lot of roads. That's a lot of schools, making sure we have coast-to-coast broadband. I think the single biggest thing that's important to me is our electric distribution infrastructure. We're on a path to decarbonize our economy, to accelerate the deployment of cleaner and cheaper energy. And we're on a path to significantly increase the electrification of our vehicle fleet. That means that we are changing where the generation is, which is going to be a huge boon to downstate Illinois where all that wind is, but that's moving where the generators are from where they are today. And we're changing where the loads are. And that means that we are going to really need to have a long overdue conversation about how to build electric transmission and how to get it from the generation to the load. And we've got a real once in a generation opportunity to build the electric grid of the future that we know we need.
So that's in addition to roads, bridges, and mass transit. Congresswoman Marie Newman, you've heard Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat in the other chamber, talking about keeping the filibuster where you'd need 10 Republicans at least to sign on to any legislation. Is infrastructure something you think could get bipartisan support, or is that going to be another party line vote?
Well, gosh, I hope we would be able to. I sit on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I think we have had some agreements along the way here. In fact, I think we had a less contentious markup than I had anticipated in the last round. So I'm hopeful that we will have it. I think we've got a lot of opportunity with the next stimulus package to invest in transit systems and high-speed rail and making everything healthier, making our infrastructure stronger. That's where the jobs are going to come from. Green union jobs will be the part of the way we move into the future economy. So I think that there will be bipartisanship. If there isn't, then it just says something about the Republican Party. It doesn't say anything about our goal to be bipartisan.
And I want to go back to Congressman Rodney Davis, because as I understand, you met with President Biden on this topic. What was that meeting like, and what in the area of infrastructure would you be in favor of?
It was a great meeting. I was very excited to be able to go into the Oval Office with a good bipartisan group of folks who are willing to get things done, willing to work together, have a bipartisan record like I do. And I talked to the vice president, who I got to know when we traveled together to Champaign-Urbana in 2015 together to rally against campus sexual assault. And we talked about the need to make this a bipartisan issue. I have been part of bipartisan highway reauthorizations in my time in Congress. We've seen the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee be the most bipartisan place in this institution. And I know Marie and I are looking forward to getting back to that. But the biggest concern I have is that we have some disagreements on infrastructure investment. My colleagues talk about green union jobs. It's not a good start when the Biden administration, in one of its first efforts, decides to shut down a pipeline project that is the difference between my union laborers making $50,000 a year.
You're talking about the Keystone Pipeline, correct?
Talking about the Keystone Pipeline. Or making my union laborers making $50,000 a year, or making over 6 figures a year. The biggest devastation to good union-paying infrastructure jobs right now has been the onslaught of executive orders, unfortunately, coming out of the administration.
I'd like to respond to that, Paris, about union labor jobs, just because I'm very close to the union community throughout Illinois.
Quickly, if you could, because I do want to get to Congressman Danny Davis, but go ahead.
I didn't know the pipeline had as many union jobs. You had union jobs that went all the way to where the pipeline is. So that's news to me, Mr. Davis. But what I would say is that the new bills that are coming out are going to not just triple or quadruple, but 10 times the number of jobs with waterway and other projects that we will use our friends at UA and the sprinkler and the pipe fitters. So we will be having many more jobs in that area. They just won't be exactly using pipelines as we use them today. So lots of opportunity as we move forward.
Congressman Danny Davis, another issue that the House took up and passed. I'm sorry, did you want to weigh in on the infrastructure issue
Well,
first?
I was only going to say that many people are trying to figure out who and what the Republican legislators are listening to and who they're following, because the polls are showing that many Republican voters are in sync with the same issues that Democratic office holders are voting for. And so I don't know who the Republican office holders, and so I'm not saying that legislation is not bipartisan. It is bipartisan because bipartisan people are in favor of it. And it seems that the legislators are looking someplace else.
Congressman, before we go, Congressman Caston, I want to talk about the voting rights bill that passed the House. Faces an uncertain future in the Senate. The criticism is, you know, voting tends to be left up to the states to run their own election as they see fit. Would this be federalizing elections?
It's not, and you know, I think we need to have a conversation about the filibuster that doesn't frame it as if that's the normal course. The H.R. 1, this voting rights bill, is, I think, the most significant pro-democracy bill that's out there. This is about reforming our campaign finance system, getting rid of gerrymandering, making Election Day a national holiday, making it easier for people to vote. We have always federalized election law, at least since the Voting Rights Act was passed, because there are states in this country that have had a long habit of disenfranchising, especially people of color. And the challenge we have is that the 20 smallest states in the country represent just 10% of the population. It is not normal course of business. It's not majoritarian to say that we're going to allow laws that are designed to protect the will of the majority in this country to be blocked by such a tiny, people who represent such a tiny minority of the population.
I'm sorry, Congressman, we're really out of time, but I do have to give Congressman Rodney Davis just a few seconds if you want to just respond to that. Only a couple seconds.
Yeah, first off, I listen to my constituents, and my constituents are the ones who need to vote how I've been casting my vote in Washington. The Voting Rights Act is not a Voting Rights Act, though. We have done everything in this country to drive historic turnout across all demographics. The bill H.R. 1 that my colleagues on this call voted for was a bill to enrich their own political campaigns by $7.2 million per election cycle. Nothing more, nothing less.
All right, I'm gonna have to leave it there. Thanks again to Representatives Danny Davis, Sean Caston, Rodney Davis, and Marie Newman. Thank you all so much. Hope to have you back soon.
Thank you, Paris.
Thank you very much.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, a new report says anti-Asian hate crimes in 16 of America's largest cities increased by nearly 150% in 2020 compared to the previous year. That report by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, looked at preliminary police data in major cities, which showed initial spikes of anti-Asian hate crimes reported in 2020 during March and April. The racial stereotyping and violence followed disinformation tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, local efforts are underway to motivate others to step in against discrimination. Joining us are Andy Kang, Executive Director of the nonprofit Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, Professor Brian Levin, Director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, and Tamer Abu Zaid, staff attorney of CARE Chicago, a nonprofit Muslim civil rights organization. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Brian Levin, let's start with you, please. Your center surveyed police departments in several major cities and found an overall increase in anti-Asian hate crimes in 2020 compared to the year before. What do you see as behind this increase?
Thank you so much for having me, and a great question. I think there were two things behind it, and we've seen this happen again and again. One is a catalytic event or a set of incremental ones that identify a certain group as legitimate targets for aggression. But here's the thing, and we've seen this over the last decade or so in particular. Once we have that dry kindling, how a president responds to this condition makes a big difference. We saw hate crimes decline after President Bush spoke tolerantly of Muslims 6 days after 9/11. But conversely, what we saw with the terror attack on San Bernardino, a 23% increase above the level of hate crime that we saw from the terror attack when then candidate Trump spoke of a Muslim ban 5 days later. So I think it's a combination of two things. One, a catalytic event, and then how people of goodwill and leaders respond, because there's stereotypes and conspiracism all around.
Here, how does the pandemic play into what is happening, what you're seeing?
Brian is right, and we have reported hate incidents, and I want to use the word incident because not every traumatic experience rises to a level of evidence of a hate crime, right? But it's still very harmful to a community member. So we've seen over the last year over 80 reported incidents in Illinois. Certainly puts us in the top 10. That's a combination of hate incidents reported both by Advancing Justice Stand Against Hatred own tracker, but also a very successful California-based one, Stop AAPI Hate. And so we combine those numbers, so we know that this is happening even in Illinois, maybe not the level in other parts of the country. And so we need to take action. And that's something that we've been partnering with CARE Chicago, with Tomer's organization, and a New York-based organization called Hollaback to bring what are called bystander intervention trainings. And this is very simple, hopefully easy to use, effective de-escalation tactics that anybody can use when they see another individual being targeted, either verbally harassed or, God forbid, that they're actually physically being harassed.
And Andy, I want to come back to some of that, the training that you just mentioned as well. But you know, Andy, I just want to ask you while I've got you, have you or anyone you've known personally experienced any anti-Asian sentiment?
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, I just recently learned that my aunt, who actually lives in Los Angeles in Koreatown, was attacked and had rocks thrown at her. I had a cousin who was on the road. He was living in Illinois and Chicago, but he was on the road down to Missouri, and he had another driver wave a gun at him. So, you know, this is very real. It's very personal for most of us in the Asian community. We know someone who has gone through this experience. And it's something that we just can't tolerate. And, you know, we're really inviting others to join us in standing against it.
And that's disturbing to hear, and I'm sorry that they've experienced that. Tomer, you know, we've heard Brian mention it. Is this racial scapegoating that's happening? Is it reminiscent of what we saw following 9/11?
Absolutely. It sounded very familiar to a lot of Muslim Americans when we heard about what was happening to the Asian and Asian American communities in the U.S. This idea that all of a sudden you wake up and you've suddenly become an enemy, you've suddenly become even more of an outsider, your neighbor may have turned against you, people are looking at you in suspicious ways. These are all things that the Muslim community saw in September 11th. And so this was really a natural thing to join up with Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago, because we have learned some things and we had some things to share, you know, and there's good news and bad news, right? We were able to say the good news is we have more resources right now. We've learned from what happened in the past. The bad news is, unfortunately, it doesn't disappear. But it can get a lot better, and we can deal with it a lot better, and we can teach folks how to deal with it, you know, and just do the best we can.
And Tomer, you know, if you would sort of discuss the scope of the intolerance that Asians may have seen in the past year, from, you know, microaggressions to outright violence.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's something really important too, because sometimes people just think of the stuff that really gets you at a visceral level, right? Like someone getting beaten up or something. But it can be something as little as people staring at you, people spitting, maybe not at you, but you know, in your direction, right? People asking you, where are you really from? Where are you really from? Jokes even. People make jokes, right? And they think, oh, it's just a joke. Don't be so serious about it. But all these little things build up. And what we really try to tell folks in the training is that these things aren't isolated and they often build up, where it starts with one thing that may seem like a lesser form of disrespect, and often it grows and grows and sometimes cements itself in policy, where we end up even passing laws that are completely discriminatory against certain communities.
And Andy, you know, just briefly, the importance of the bystander training, because a lot of folks may be a bystander and don't know how to handle it or how to respond.
And that's what we're trying to overcome, is folks freezing in the moment. You know, they want to help, but they don't know what they can do that wouldn't make the situation worse. Certainly, we're not asking people to intervene physically and put themselves more in harm, right? So we want to give as much information to people so that do what they can to help mitigate some of these really terrible things that are happening in the community.
And Brian Levin, we've got about 20 seconds left. You know, when the official hate crime FBI data for 2020 comes out later on, do you suspect we'll see an increase in these kinds of hate crimes and incidents?
Oh, well, we're totally, the question is not whether we're going to see an increase. This is a historic one, and we stand with our Asian friends and neighbors on this. The big question is, of the ones that we've classified just as crimes, are they getting reported to police? And if the majority do, we're not only going to see a probable century high, we may even see an all-time high for FBI reported hate crime. The record for that was in '96. Let's see. But this is going to be a pivotal year. We saw a rotation where, while hate crimes overall are down, attacks against Asian people are up at historic levels.
And unfortunately, that means we'll have to keep discussing this into the future. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Andy Kang, Brian Levin, and Tamara Abuzaid. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, the pros and cons of a cashless society. But first, a look at the weather. The Illinois Tollway announces it will no longer accept cash tolls, making permanent a change it rolled out early in the pandemic. The tollway system says the vast majority of drivers use iPass or EasyPass to pay, and that it's expanding a program to help low-income people pay their tolls. As more and more of society goes cashless, could lower-income people and people of color be shut out from the economy? Or do cash-free transactions benefit businesses and consumers? Joining us to discuss that is Horacio Mendez, CEO of the Woodstock Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Horacio, what would you say are the problems with handling cash? Are there costs to businesses and safety concerns?
Well, there is a high cost to running the infrastructure behind the cash economy. You've got ATMs, armored trucks, having to go to the bank, opening, closing, counting cash drawers, back office stuff. You get the idea. According to some fairly recent research, cash costs on average about 9% of cash received. Now, you compare that to the average cost of a cashless transaction. There is a difference, but kind of depending upon the transaction itself.
What would you say how would you compare or quantify that comparison between cash and cashless?
Well, you've got the two owners in the space. It's Visa and MasterCard, who charge in the neighborhood of 3 to 3.5% plus about 15 cents per transaction. Now, if you have that fee structure on a relatively small purchase, let's say a $5 cup of coffee, at 3.5% cost. Now, technically, the coffee shop pays that, but we all know that it gets added to the cost of the product you're buying. And since more and more people are paying cashless, and I'm not sure anybody really gets much of a discount when they pay cash anymore, we're all paying for it regardless of which method you use. So it might be faster, might not always be cheaper, but we're already paying for it.
So, I mean, why might some businesses then, maybe they would want to go cash only?
Well, like I said, the cost, cash only, you mean? Mm-hmm. Well, that is, again, cash only has a higher cost associated with it with regard to the time that your employees are going to be not only managing cash, but also the time that you'll have to be able to spend to secure it, to count it, to deposit it. So there are a variety of different extra services that you're going to have to pay for associated with handling cash.
So it's estimated that about 30% of Americans don't have a credit card, and that 7 million households in the U.S. are unbanked, that they're more likely to be lower income, less educated, and more likely to be people of color. Now, Chicago tried and then phased out a program that let unbanked people load money onto their transit cards. Do you think governments have a role in helping unbanked people access the cashless economy?
Yeah, I think there's a role for the local, state, and federal government to play in giving those at the very bottom of the income spectrum access to the cashless society by negotiating with banks, credit card service providers to provide affordable cashless benefits in a way that mirrors how many people manage and use credit cards. But remember, that only touches a certain segment of the population. That's not going to touch all 30% of the folks that don't have access to credit cards. The 7% of Illinoisans who do not have any relationship with the financial institution, 23% of those are Black households, 14% of them are Latino, 2% are white. And the map on these things always are the same. If it's family wealth, health outcomes, access to banking products, educational outcomes, White Sox versus Cubs, the map always shows the same kind of disparities. It just ends up being the header that changes.
Are there some people, for example, who would not want to go cashless, for example, citing privacy concerns?
Oh, no, absolutely. If you think people are freaking out about the fact that the government is telling us to wear a mask or that Alexa is listening to every one of our conversations, how do you think we'll feel about two for-profit companies knowing your every move and purchase? Even in that vein, though, let's say the executives of MasterCard and Visa suddenly decide that they hate birds, for example, and block all donations by card to the Audubon Society. Well, there goes the Audubon Society, and that's totally legal right now. So if you don't have that alternative, then all of a sudden you need to start tightening up a lot of rules and making sure that the unintended consequences don't always fall back on the low and moderate income, which it usually does, but also think a little bit broader about the role of financial services and how people engage with the economy. It's very similar to the conversation we're having about voting. The easier you make it to vote, be it early, online, by mail, all these other sorts of things, it's engaging people to be able to make something that's essential in the economy and for our society easy and accessible according to where people are. The same needs to be held true with regard to how people engage with the economy.
Now, I mean, in the 20 seconds we've got left, though, I mean, are we just marching towards this? Is this likely to happen in the future as businesses and governments lean towards cashless more and more?
Well, I mean, we're already there. It's like the numbers in Europe and in Asia are astronomical. They have very different consumer protection laws, but we really need, and that's the role of Woodstock, we really need to make sure that we're keeping an eye on those unintended consequences because they're always there.
Okay. Horacio Mendez, thank you so much for joining us. And that is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
And you can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7.
Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Polk Brothers Foundation, working to make Chicago a place where all people have the opportunity to reach their full potential.